I am the Chief Planning Officer. I am still the Chief Planning Officer of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, New Jersey, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our presentation this evening about the 2020 Greater Metro West Jewish Community Study with a focus on Eastern Morris County. I've only been at Federation for a few months. If I haven't gotten to meet you yet, I'm looking forward to meeting you soon. It's great to have you here in this sort of group setting, but I'm really been enjoying over my time. I started back in August, getting to know all of the members of the Jewish community in Greater Metro West. And it's been a wonderful start for me in the community and a really great time to join the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West team, because we have this community study that we are so glad to share with you. The purpose of the 2020 community study is to provide the Greater Metro West Jewish community with reliable information to help all of us, those of us at the Federation like myself, but also all of you throughout the Jewish community, to be able to better fulfill our mission, to care for people in our community and build a vibrant Jewish community in Greater Metro West, New Jersey. Now, we haven't collected this sort of data about the Greater Metro West community in over 20 years. So I think it was really terrific that the Federation leadership a few years ago already invested in a state-of-the-art research study to learn about ourselves. They engaged the Maurice and Marilyn Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, which is a renowned multidisciplinary research institute dedicated to the study of American Jewry and religious and cultural identity. The community study was released last month in November and is available for everyone in the community to read the reports and dive into the data on the Federation website. And this evening, we're really glad to invite you into the conversation. I'm very pleased that Janet Aaronson, the lead researcher of our community study, is with us tonight. She's going to share details about how she and her team at the Cohen Center collected the data, and then she's going to present a number of key findings, some of which is applicable across the whole Greater Metro West community, and then she'll focus in specifically on some regional statistics around Eastern Morris County. And at the end of her presentation, we'll have opportunities for questions for Janet. We're going to be taking questions through the chat. As Janet's presenting, if questions come to mind, feel free to just put them right in the chat and I'll be moderating. And then we'll also have moments after her presentation for more questions to come through then. So a moment of formal introduction. Janet Krasner Aaronson is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. She earned her PhD in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis, and she has directed and contributed to local Jewish community studies in over a dozen communities. A recent study that was released under Janet's leadership in the Chicago Jewish community, and most recently, just a few weeks ago, here in Greater Metro West, New Jersey. And Janet is especially happy to be learning about the Greater Metro West community because it's her home community. She grew up in Union County and is a proud graduate of what used to be called the Solomon Schechter Day School of Essex in Union. When she went there, we know it as the Golda Ach Academy. And so it's really wonderful to welcome Janet back home to Greater Metro West. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jen.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks everyone for being here. What I didn't tell Ben before was that I also connected to Morris County and right on the line. After my parents left Union, they moved eventually to Rockaway in Fox Hills when it was first open. And they had a home there and in Jerusalem. They just a couple of years ago, they sold their place in Fox Hills and now are in Jerusalem full time. And so I've been in that neck of the woods very often, which when I grew up in Union felt very, very far away, but I became familiar with that neighborhood and it was fun looking at these communities very closely. So I am going to spend some time, as Ben talked about, some general overview about how we did the study and some things to think about as you're reading the study reports. Gives you some general information about population estimates and key findings, and then we're going to dig into the regional differences and the geography. As you read the findings, so you'll find the reports on the Federation website, and there is a report, there's an overview, There's a key findings report, which is kind of in bullet form, the key findings of all the study. There's an overview, which is where I recommend that you start. And then reports on each topic. I would encourage you to take a look at all the reports, at least on a high level, because the story is told in all of the different reports together. And as you read these, there are a lot of numbers, there are a lot of tables, but what I'd suggest you think about is really the patterns. What's the story that you see in the numbers? Where are there meaningful differences between people of different ages, people who live in different places? And that's sort of where you start to see the meaningful story that emerges. We did the study in October to December of 2020. So just exactly a year ago was when we closed the data collection. We got responses from almost 3,300 Jewish households in Greater Metro West. That's a very large number. And it allows us to do some analysis of groups within the community. I'll be talking about those later. But one of the important things to keep in mind is the timing of the study, that it was really in the heart of the COVID epidemic. We're maybe we're not in the heart of it anymore, although we're still in it. So some of the questions need to be understood in that context of what was going on in that time. We tried to be careful about it. So when we asked about things like time frames, did you ever do it? Often we asked, did you do it recently, since the start of the pandemic? Did you do it before? And we also asked about a lot of online behavior. So we asked, if you went to a Jewish sponsored program or attended services, we asked if it was online or in person or both. So we were really trying to capture what was going on at that time. And I think that will then serve as a really valuable baseline for what's going to happen in the community going forward. So now I'll start talking about what we found from the survey. And the place to start is the number of people in the Greater Metro West community. And you'll see there are a lot of numbers on the page, just because there's a lot of ways to think about who's in the community. The first one I'll start with is over 122,000 Jewish people in Greater Metro West. That's adults and children. They live in almost 57,000 Jewish households. A Jewish household is one in which there is at least one Jewish adult. But of course, not everybody in those Jewish households is themselves Jewish. So if you think about all of the people in the Jewish households, that's 155,000. So that, if you want a number that's the most expansive view of the Greater Metro West Jewish community, I would use that number, keep that in mind. So how do we define who is Jewish for the purposes of the study? That's something everybody wants to know. So in terms of adults, we consider somebody Jewish. First of all, they have to consider themselves Jewish. It might be Jewish by religion. It might be Jewish ethnically, culturally. And some of them also have another religion. So they're Jewish and another religion. But all of these people share that they were either raised Jewish, had at least one Jewish parent, or they converted to Judaism. So that's Jewish adults. For Jewish children, it's a bit simpler. It's just if their parents consider them Jewish, they are Jewish. So turning to some demographics about the community, this slide shows the age of just the Jewish adults in Greater Metro West. And you can see the top row is Greater Metro West. The middle row is all US Jews, and the bottom row is all US adults. So you can see that in Metro West, these numbers down here, there are a lot less young adults, that in this case, it's people under age 35 in Greater Metro West than average for all Jewish communities. And there are a lot more people in these two blue categories, that's 45 to 64. I think knowing the composition of the community, this will not be surprising. There are not as many, it's a mostly suburban community, not as many young young adults, and most of the young adults in the community are people who are living in their parents' households, and some of them might have been there because of COVID. Another thing that we look at is the composition of households. So this is in terms of all households, about 3/4 of households include a couple. That could be a married couple or partners living together. About half of them are married, two Jewish adults in the couple. About half are intermarried. The rate of intermarriage in Greater Metro West is a little bit less than for all Jews on average, which is consistent with the fact that the community is a little bit older. When we think about the Jewish children in the community, it's quite similar. About half of Jewish children are being raised by intermarried parents. About half are being raised by unmarried parents, and a small number, 8%, are being raised by single parents. This graph, which I'm apologize, it's a little hard to read, just shows you the composition of all the different households. So we have here these two slides, these two slices are households with children, and that makes about 30% of households. These two slides are couples, and based on the age of the couples without children. So that's in total about 30% of households. Only about 19% of households is a single adult living alone, and this divides them by age. This last category, about 1 in 5 households, we call them multi-generational. Those are those households that I mentioned that it's either parents living with their young adult children at home, or it could be adults living with elderly parents. So it's any generation. A few high-level statistics about Jewish engagement that I wanted to share. 29% of households are members of a synagogue of any type. Because there can be multiple Jewish adults in a synagogue member household, actually 31% of adults live in a synagogue member household. I'm mentioning that because that's a comparable number to the Pew study, which reports statistics on adults and not in households. And so the share of adults who are synagogue members, just a tiny bit less than the average, not a real difference. But what's important here is that even though less than 1/3 of Jewish adults live in synagogue member households, half of Jewish adults attended some synagogue service in the last 6 months. Now, here's a place where we included both in person and online. And we don't know the answer, but it's interesting to think about how much of this was driven by COVID, and that maybe more people participated than would have otherwise. In terms of Jewish denominations, the middle column here shows the denominations of Greater Metro West Jewish adults. And on the right, it's the same numbers for the Pew for the national numbers. So 4% of Greater Metro West Jewish adults are Orthodox compared to 9% of all US Jewish adults. Even though that seems like a big difference, relatively speaking, it may not be as much of a difference. This might be just due to this sampling. What's most important, and that we see in both locally and nationally, is the large share of people who do not identify with a specific denomination. That is 38% of Greater Metro West Jewish adults. In the survey question, these people either said that they are, instead of picking a denomination, they said either I'm secular, culturally Jewish, or I'm just Jewish, and it's about half and half. So we combine those and consider them no denomination. Now, this is a trend in the United States. More and more Jewish adults are not identifying with a specific denomination. So it can be a little hard to know, what does that mean? And does that mean that they're completely unaffiliated or disengaged? So we have provided another way to understand, to kind of analyze this and to think about Jewish engagement outside of this model of denomination. And the way that we provided to think about it is what we call the index of Jewish engagement. This is a typology of what does Jewish engagement look like based not on the labels that people call themselves, but based on a set of behaviors. What do they actually do? So this was a set of almost 20 behaviors, and this included ritual behaviors, communal behaviors, individual behaviors, that is things that people do at home with their friends, with their family. And we looked at them and analyzed them statistically to see what are the patterns of behavior, what are the clusters that people tend to do these kinds of things, but not these kinds of things, and how many people in the community are doing those different types. So one thing that's interesting is that 16% of people are in what we call the minimally involved group. They actually do very little in Jewish life in terms of their behaviors. And it's almost the same size who are in the immersed category. Those are the people who sort of do everything. Then also the same size is the involved group, that they do many things, not everything like the immersed do, but they're very involved in many aspects of Jewish life. I think what's new to the conversation, new to help us think about Jewish engagement, is these two groups in the middle. They're each about a quarter of the Jewish community. One of them we call the familial, one we call the personal. The familial is the group that most of what they do in Jewish life are the home holidays, which are Passover and Hanukkah. And they almost all of them do both of those. And that seems to be their primary Jewish connection because they don't do a lot of other Jewish things. In contrast, we have this other group called the personal group. Most of what they do is Jewish life at home, which means things like talk about Jewish topics with their friends, read Jewish news, read news about Israel, participate in Jewish cultural activities, but it's things that are at home and not with organizations. So one way to kind of just help understand this is, how does this differ from denominations? And you can see along the top that the vast majority of Orthodox Jews are in that immersed group, 84% of them. So it's not surprising that most of them do all of the aspects of Jewish life, but a good number, 15%, are in the personal group. Their Jewish life is mostly at home. Now, some of these people are, it might be because of COVID that they weren't doing as much in the synagogue, they weren't going to services as often. And some of it might be people who describe themselves as Orthodox, but are just not connected to synagogue life. What's really important here is to look at that no denomination group that I mentioned was 38% of Jewish adults. That's a pretty significant number. And I said it's important to know that they are not disengaged from Jewish life. Yes, a quarter of them are in the minimally involved group, but the rest of them, 3/4, are engaged in Jewish life in a variety of ways. And you can see about 1/3 are in the familial group, and about 1/3 are in the personal group. So the purpose of this typology is to help think about what does Jewish engagement mean based on behaviors, and kind of expand our view from the view that's just using denomination labels. So on a high level, that's the information I wanted to provide as a community as a whole. And now I'm going to dig into geography. So here's a map that shows the greater Metro West catchment area and the 4 regions that we've defined, Union and Essex. And here is Eastern Morris County. Over here, the rest of Morris County has been combined with Sussex and part of Somerset to make up a region that we're calling Western Greater Metro West. We did this for 2 reasons. One, just a very practical reason, we need enough respondents in each region so that we can tell you something. So statistically, we have enough people so that we can tell you something. And the truth is that this great big pink area is so, the Jewish density is so much less that we kind of needed to borrow a little bit of Morris County to get enough people so that we could really tell you about that region. But there's a more conceptual region, and we spent a lot of time early on in the study thinking about where this line goes. And as I mentioned, I was actually familiar with Rockaway, and I'm sure you are all more familiar, but really thinking about where this line should be. And even when you look at the density here, you see there's a real qualitative difference in the experience of Jewish life in the part that's closer to Essex versus closer to Sussex. So rather than just using the county line, we drew this line. And I'm not going to try to zoom in here, but you are welcome to look at that. And there's in the report that talks about geography, we have a detailed list of every zip code and where it got assigned. The red dots on this map represent 25 households, just kind of randomly put in the zip code. Don't try to find your house, but it gives you a sense of the density of the Jewish population. So here we have that 38% of Jewish households are in Essex, and the next largest is 25% are in East Morris. And similar shares are in Union and in the Western Greater Metro West, and their proportions are just about the same whether you think about households, adults, or children. Here are the numbers. I'm not going to read them all to you, but these are in the report, and just so you can see that it's often helpful to think about numbers as well. So over 40,000 Jewish households are in the East Morris region. And this is just the percentages. And then I'll add the density. It turns out that if you just look at this, 12% of households in East Morris are Jewish households. And when you take a look at this, it looks, I mean, it is the highest number here. So it has the greatest density, just thinking about households. And one thing to keep in mind, though, that Essex also includes Newark. So if you excluded all of Newark, Essex would actually be the most dense region. And that's pretty noticeable on that map as well. But East Morris is the next dense in terms of population, not in terms of geography. And here's a look at age. This is the age, I showed you just slightly different numbers of the first chart, of all Jewish adults in Greater Metro West. And here are the age differences within each region. So you can see that Essex has the smallest share of 18 to 34-year-olds. East Morris has a little bit more, but Union and Western Greater Metro West has the largest share. And again, pointing out this could be young couples. This also can include adults living with their parents. So in that age range, you can see that the majority of East Morris Jewish adults, as with the whole community, are in the 50 to 75 age range. And here's household composition, and 30% of East Morris households include children. Minor children are age 17 and younger. Also the same number are couples without children. And then we have some singles without children and the multi-generational. We asked in this study a lot of questions about people's financial situation and financial economic vulnerability, and I encourage you to look at the report about that. But this is just a brief summary, because among the questions we asked, how do you describe your financial status? And the two categories that were struggling the most were not having enough money or just getting by, just having enough to get by. We combined those two categories in this one category called struggling, financially struggling. 17% of all Jewish households are financially struggling, but you can see the number in East Morris is quite a bit less. 9% in East Morris is financially struggling. The other regions have more people who are in poverty. But you can see that at the well-off, it's not like all of those people are well off. The increase is this people in this, what I call the middle category, about 55% of people, so that they have enough money. So that's the big, there's a big financial difference in East Morris households. In terms of Jewish engagement, that's that index that I explained to you. And the nice thing about it is that it captures so many aspects of Jewish behavior that we don't have to look at them one by one and look at synagogue membership and other memberships and lighting Shabbat candles individually. We can look at the whole picture. And what you can see here is that East Morris has the largest share of these folks in the minimally involved group. It's about 16% of all Jewish adults, but 22% of the Jewish adults in East Morris. So Jewish engagement is a little bit lower. On the other hand, in this immersed group, 13% are immersed, fully involved in Jewish life. And that share is lower in Western Greater Metro West. So in some ways, this is sort of in between. Essex and Union are quite similar, and it's in between with Metro West, with Western. Denomination, which is more similar, more familiar. Union has the largest share of Orthodox Jews by far. East Morris has 2%, Essex has 4%. I spent some time talking about the people with no denomination. They're in every region, and the numbers vary a little bit, but basically it is the high 30s or 40% of every region are people with no denomination. Some things on synagogue membership. And I mentioned earlier in a slide showing the percent of people who are members of a synagogue versus the percent of people who attended services. This slide is specifically about high holiday services in 2020. And you can see, for example, in Union, it's the same number who are members of a synagogue and attended services. They're equally high. And in Essex, about a third of people are synagogue members and 45% attended high holidays. In East Morris, the synagogue membership is a little bit lower, 29%, but high holiday service attendance is high, it's actually the highest, half of people. So what this points out to, this higher is that there are a lot of opportunities for attending services and without being a synagogue member. And those were particularly true during COVID, but that's generally true. We see it with people attending services at Chabad, people attending services at places where they don't have to be a member. So this is important to note the distinction between these numbers. In terms of organizational involvement, we have relatively low membership in the JCC or the Y. This is not surprising that it's higher in Essex and Union. About 9% are members of another organization. Here, that's also highest in Essex. These numbers are highlighted, and you'll see this in the report. That means that there's a real difference in the population, what we call statistically significant difference in the population as a whole. And so indeed, membership is higher in Essex and Union. These other numbers, even though there's slight differences in the numbers, program participation and donating to Jewish organization is the same for people regardless of where they live. And I'm going to end with a lot of data about feelings of connection to the community, about a lot of attitudes about what does Judaism mean. And that's all in the report, but I'm going to just show you one. And to show this question is, to what extent do you feel connected to a local Jewish community? The top row is all adults. all Jewish adults. And you can see that in Essex and Union, about a quarter of people feel very connected, about a quarter feel not at all connected. In East Morris, about a third of people feel not at all connected to a local Jewish community, and 13% feel very connected. So that brings me to my end of my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Janet, so much for walking us through all of that data and helping us see the big picture and also a little bit of those regional differences. What we're going to do now is we're going to turn to questions for Janet. So like I said before, please do put your questions right in the chat, and I'll moderate and bring the questions to Janet. And you can start putting those questions in now. While you're putting your first questions, just a word about the questions themselves. So please do ask questions about anything that Janet presented tonight, any of her slides, any questions about methodology, any of the data points she brought. Also, if you've had a chance to read the reports already, feel free to ask any questions about them as well. By the way, I just put the link to the reports in the chat so you can access it easily if you hadn't accessed it yet. And if you have questions about, in this particular report on this page, there's this data point, and you can point us to the data point, Janet can comment on that. However, as great as Janet is at answering questions about all these data points, you can see that this was a massive data set, and we don't expect Janet to have put the whole thing to memory. So please don't ask Janet, some question she didn't touch on or some data point to just pull off the top of her head, because that won't be as constructive as any questions about anything she presented tonight or anything else in the reports that's of interest. So yeah, so let's get some questions coming in. So while we're waiting for folks to put questions in the chat, Janet, one of the questions we've had a few times tonight, you spoke a lot about comparing the different regions within Greater Metro West. Sometimes we've been asked about comparing Greater Metro West to national statistics or to other statistics that you're familiar with, and maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. So fortunately, just at the same time this study was done, the Pew Survey of American Jews was conducted. Just they finished their data collection a little bit early, but it came out just around the same time. So where we can provide comparisons to national data, and we have drawn them from Pew. In some cases, the questions were not asked exactly in the same way. They're not directly comparable, but we try as best we can to make comparisons because we know that's useful. In some cases, I think, as I showed with the synagogue example, sometimes because they report things different ways, we have to show you we have to make sure we're doing apples to apples comparison. Now, as Ben mentioned in the intro, we have done a lot of studies of the American Jewish community and a lot of different communities. Our practice is not to report direct comparisons from one community to another because communities are so different from each other, and context is so important in terms of understanding the dynamics of a community. And Greater Metro West is particularly unique in the sense that it's really a set of suburbs, contiguous suburbs. It's not like Pittsburgh with a central Jewish core and then suburbs around it. It's certainly not like Chicago in terms of size. So just really compare things apples to apples. It's very hard to do. People are welcome to look at any of the reports that are on our website. But I think that one of the main differences is it's not just the geography, but the demographics is that there are not a lot of young adults in Greater Metro West. So it's not like a lot of other big cities. And you have, so that's why, the fact that it's older makes sense, that it's the fact that it's more people with children, more married couples makes sense. And we know that those age, marital status, and financial status, among many other factors, are real drivers of Jewish engagement. So, and we have to take all of those into account when you do comparisons.
Thanks, Janet. Still waiting to get some questions from the crowd. Oh, here we go. Oh, here's a first question, Janet, is a methodology question.
Mhm.
How did you get to calculate a roughly 57,000 households with a with only 3,300 respondents?
Okay, boy, that is such a good question.
And I know that the answer to that is super complicated. So
Yeah,
you're going to boil it down
I'm
for those
gonna,
of us who are not statisticians.
I will boil it down, and I will be happy to have an offline conversation with Shell or anyone who wants the details, or refer you to the methodological appendix. But basically, it's the way survey research is done. Many people are familiar with election polls. It's not all that different. You draw a sample of people, and then you adjust them. You adjust those respondents. So it's not like every respondent counts for the same number in the household. It's all based on how did you draw the sample? Who do they, you try to figure out who did they stand in for? The other thing that we do, which I think is important to mention, is that we do all sorts of adjustments of the population based on what we know about the community. So we gathered, and some of you may have been involved with us, helped us do this. We gathered data, administrative data, about the number of synagogue member households in each synagogue, and we added them all up, the number of children enrolled in different kinds of school. And we use that to make adjustments, because not only do we want to make sure that we have the right numbers, but we also want to make sure we have the right characteristics of the community. And as you can imagine, people who are more engaged with the Jewish community are much more likely to answer a message and get a letter and get on their computer to run and do the survey or answer an email. So we do a lot of work to get the less engaged members of the community, and then we have to do a lot of statistical adjustments to make sure they reflect the community as a whole. And I think I'll leave it at that and leave the statistics for, again, a follow-up if anybody
Thanks,
wants.
Janet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you mentioned in your overview that we, relative to other studies of this sort, we had a very good response rate for this study.
Yes.
And there's a lot of confidence in the data, even within those ranges that because they're estimates that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Gary put a couple of questions in. The first one says that that he recalls reading that a number of respondents reported not finding Jewish services to be available. I'm not sure which data point Gary's referring to. I recall there's a question about health services that we looked at, which whether folks who are in need of health or disability services to receive those services from Jewish services. I don't recall other parts of the report off the top of my head, but the question was, do we have that data for Eastern Morris? Can we break that down? So I'm not expecting, Janet, for you to know that off the top of your head, if you truthfully, but maybe you can comment on, the crosstabs that we've talked about.
Right. So I think I'm not going to take the time to pull it up, but I think one of the problems is, even though we have this large sample, there's only so many ways we can slice it and dice it. The fact is that the people who need services are a relatively small subset of the community. So I don't think we're able to break down differences by region. But I would say yes. If I would imagine that it's significant in all of the communities. Yeah, in all of the regions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I see a few more questions.
Another question was, the prior survey was of any use, and did we see any trends? So Janet already talked about comparing across current data that we have. That question is about the last time we did a survey, which was over 20 years ago. And I know that Janet and her team did take a look at it, so I'll let her comment.
Right. So there were quite a few methodological differences between the surveys, geographic differences. We did do an analysis trying to look at population trends. That was really our focus, and we found that there was a increase in population. I shared that with Ben, and I don't know if you want to share that further. It was just sort of an internal memo, but there's some information we we have, but we did, because there were so many differences, we didn't dig into look at trends of like changes in Jewish engagement. I will say though, that when you want to look at changes in Jewish engagement, the best thing to look at is the real numbers out there in the world. So if you know that synagogues are opening or closing, and you know that the day schools are growing or shrinking, that is real data on the ground, and you should, track that and be aware of it. So what you don't have is the population size. So is it growing because the population is growing, or is it growing because people are more interested? So, we could sort of kind of triangulate and put some of that information together. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenna. I mean, I'll add, I think you may have mentioned, but another challenge is that the Greater Metro West's borders, we are a merger of two federations, Metro West and Central, and none of that had happened 20 plus years ago. So even the study itself wasn't the same location. So there were a whole bunch of challenges that we faced doing it apples to apples. So we've got a great snapshot of 2020 data that we're using as sort of a baseline to move forward. And that leads to the next question, which is a snapshot of 2020. And this question is about the pandemic, which was taking place when we were collecting data. And the question is, would another survey done at a different time, have a different impact? And, would we expect differences? What do you think, Janet?
Yeah. Well, yes, the survey was planned. It was all ready to go. And then I think it was programmed already, and we were about ready to send letters. And then the pandemic hit, and we said, let's just press pause and let's see what happens. So we pressed pause, we waited till the fall, we adjusted some of the questions to try to capture it. So the thinking about it is that things are not going to go back to the way they were before the pandemic. So, because it's been going on so long. So, I think this is the new baseline, and I would just move forward to treating this as the baseline. Now, I will say that the center did a study of COVID impact before, and because this study was, when we put the study on hold, Greater Metro West was one of 10 participating communities on what was going on during the pandemic. And one of the follow-up activities and research that Ben will talk about at the end of the session is actually look at people's experience at those 2 points in time. I think I can't help it, of course I'll say this, regular research is a great idea. In the study, we collected contact information. So we asked people, are you willing to be recontacted for another survey? And I think it would be really beneficial for the community to, at minimum, doesn't have to be this big demographics survey, but to go out and, reach out to some of those people in 3 years and the subgroups that you're most concerned about. And see what's up with them.
Thanks, Janet. So look, to Janet's point, Federation hasn't decided yet what our next set of research will be. We're in the process of digging through this amazing amount of data about our community, but surely that's part of our thinking we need to do, which is, what's the frequency and the type of data we're going to need to collect to be able to plan for the future. And that relates to the next question, actually, how to interpret this data. This question reads, do you have recommendations about how to interpret the data? In particular, the question reads in terms of programming and outreach. And here's like a personal way of framing it. Menashe writes, how concerned should we be?
Yeah. So I'm not concerned. I think that there are tremendous opportunities in the data. And I think that there's certainly a narrative in the Jewish community about declining engagement. And this narrative was really reinforced by the Pew study. That's not what I see when I look at the work that I do with local communities. What I see is different ways of engaging Jewish life. And that's exactly why we created this model. Now, some people will say if there are families who are, they're lighting Hanukkah candles with their children and they're having a Seder and that's all they're doing, that's not really Jewish engagement. I think it is Jewish engagement. I think that there's an opportunity there. If they are doing those things or they're reading Jewish books at home and they're involved with Jewish life with their friends and family, not religious life, they're engaged in Jewish life. I think if we focus too much on synagogue membership, we're going to say, oh, synagogue numbers are going down, and that's not Jewish engagement. That's unaffiliated. That's just disaffiliation. But I think if the opportunities to reach out to people, understand what the survey tries to do, what the study tries to do, is explain where our people are, what are people doing, what is their starting point. The best guide to knowing what people are interested in is to look at what they're already doing and try to enrich it, try to make it more of that. Maybe understand, have them connected with the Jewish community, rather than saying, if you don't join a synagogue, join a Jewish organization, you're not connected. And I think that COVID, with this online Jewish life, gives us a tremendous opportunity to reach people who are not walking into the doors of institutions. And you're walking into their computer, and let's take advantage of it.
Thanks, Janet. So all sorts of interesting information about how the Jews in Greater Metro West connect Jewishly are specifically in a report titled Jewish Engagement, and another word entitled Community Connections. So if that's an area that you want to think more about, those are the reports to start with. And then to ask those type of questions that Janet encourages us to ask about, how would we engage with those folks? Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question here. Were there any OMG surprise findings? Janet, how would you respond to that? Did you have anything that really surprised you as you looked through this data?
Yeah, well, I maybe not surprised me, but really, really did stand out. It's hard to surprise me. But what I would say is, what I think is that, again, it's the varieties of Jewish engagement. This is the subject that I'm most passionate about, by the way. But I think looking at even areas where there is high Jewish engagement, where in Union 10% of people are Orthodox, and in Essex there are all these traditional centers of Jewish life in Livingston and all those communities, we have to always remember they're still the minority, even though they may be the most visible and we're very aware of them. Most Jews are engaging in these other ways, and we have to kind of always balance that and not be and not be caught up in what we see. And I think every time I do this kind of presentation, I'm always aware of the people at the presentation. And I'm in the same way. I'm very involved in the Jewish bubble of my world in Massachusetts. It's so important to remember, not everybody, I am not typical. The people I associate with, my friends, my community, are a minority of the Jewish world, and the majority thinks very differently about Jewish life. And I think this is a golden opportunity to kind of learn what that is. And it's not a dichotomy. It's not immersed or nothing. It's a range. And I think there are many, many people who think Judaism is important to them, and they're interested in it, even if it's not, how they're spending every moment of their day.
Yeah. Thanks, Janet. Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in, having read the data pretty carefully at this point, right? Like that, I agree with Janet that for me, I don't know if it was surprising, but it certainly stood out that I think all sorts of assumptions about what Jews of different sorts engage in were really, questioned by the data that we have here. where lower institutional membership, but high percentages of Jewish activities. Half of married couples being married to someone who doesn't identify as Jewish, and also identifying as a Jewish household and participating in Jewish activities in these large numbers. I think all of that really stood out as we look through the data. So with having gone through all the questions in the chat, I want to say thank you to Janet for walking us through all of the information that she did tonight and for answering these questions. And thank all of you for joining us and helping us think this through. This is really the beginning of a conversation, getting this study out over this last month. And now it's up to us to do what we just started to do in the last few minutes. Think about, what does this data mean and what might we do about it in response to strengthen our Jewish community? At Federation, we're doing the same. Our lay leaders and professionals are working in partnership to bring together trends from across the community study reports and to identify priority areas for attention and exploration based on the data. And as we do that work in the weeks and months ahead, we'll be in touch with the community to share what we're working on. At the same time, we hope you're going to have similar conversations in your communities in Eastern Morris, whether it's at synagogues or in other institutions that you're connected with. And that as you have those conversations as they relate to your communities and organizations, if additional questions come up, we really want to be thought partners with you. Please feel free to be in touch with me. Happy to think more about where we can find you data in the study. I'm actually collecting lots of follow-up questions of things that, we see what's in the reports, but we want to dig deeper. So as those things come up, feel free to be in touch with me. We'll be glad to really continue the dialogue and be in partnership, like I said before, to accomplish the goal of this study, which is to give us all this data so we can strengthen our Jewish community together. So with that, I want to say thanks to everybody, wish everyone an Erev Tov, a good evening, and have a good night.